Today, Emily found herself in an unusually buoyant mood. The reason being she was just days away from her long-anticipated break. It was her final week at work, and the prospect of an upcoming vacation fueled her excitement. After officially completing her work duties, she made her way home, completely unaware of the surprise that awaited her. That evening, she arrived home with her spirits higher than usual. Spotting her husband's packed suitcase in the hallway brought a delighted smile to her face. She assumed he had taken the initiative to pack for their vacation. James, her husband, was never particularly good at packing, yet this time he had not only managed to do it himself, but also found the travel pillow, something she found most amusing and endearing. "James, my love, I'm back," Emily cheerfully announced as she entered the kitchen. But her happiness abruptly faded upon seeing the sight before her. James was seated at the kitchen table, a glass of wine in hand. He was dressed not in his usual casual home attire, but as if he was ready to leave the house. "Sweetheart, what's happening? Are you heading out?" she asked, her confusion apparent. "Emily, I'm weary," James began, his tone somber. "I need to go now. I need some time to unwind, to rest. I'm afraid I might be depressed." Emily stared at her husband, bewilderment clouding her eyes. "Darling, what do you mean? Can't you wait just one more week?" She was at a loss, unable to comprehend the sudden shift in her husband's mood. "You wouldn't understand, Emily," he replied tersely. "You're always cheerful at work, surrounded by your supportive team. Meanwhile, I'm here, feeling low and in desperate need of a break." Her eyes then fell on a bank statement lying on the table. To her dismay, it was clear that James had transferred the money they had painstakingly saved together into his personal account. Holding the statement, she said, "James, what depression are you referring to? We've been saving this money for our shared vacation, for our trip to the Bahamas. I've been eagerly waiting for this day, and now you're asking me to delay it because your work won't permit you a vacation." James retorted, his voice beginning to show irritation. Emily could feel her anger brewing. "I never said my work wouldn't grant me a vacation," she fired back. "In fact, I agreed with him today that this is my last week. Besides, we never set a specific date for our trip. Why would you plan your leave now when I can't join?" "You're not being rational today, Emily," he rebuked her. "I told you I'm exhausted. I've had enough of the dreary cold weather. I need a change somewhere warm, somewhere peaceful. And what about me?" she demanded, feeling neglected. Her husband merely shrugged in response. "Well, practically speaking, you can't come along. You're tied up with work. I don't understand why we're arguing about this. I'm the head of the family, and I get to decide what's best for us." James's brows furrowed, his anger visible. She watched him pack the rest of his belongings. This wasn't some ill-conceived jest. He was serious about leaving alone, without... "But James, that's not fair," she protested. "We saved that money together. If you can't wait for me, at least you should only take your share. Whilst I get my leave, I'll join you or go somewhere else using my portion." James paused and looked at her, his face devoid of empathy. "What do you want, Emily? Do you want me to stay and have a mental breakdown? How am I supposed to divide the money? What if I run out? How about this? If there's anything left, I'll bring it back. And Emily, I have a huge favor to ask. Don't ruin my mood before the trip. I've mentally already embarked on this journey. In fact, I've booked my flight for tonight." Emily was rendered speechless by his audacity, by the fact that he had already booked his ticket for that very evening. Words seemed to elude her. A pang of hurt constricted her throat, and she retreated to her room to avoid witnessing her husband's departure. She had sensed something amiss lately. James had been acting out of character, coming home late, initiating uncharacteristic lengthy conversations. She just couldn't put her finger on why his behavior had suddenly altered. Emily had initially tucked away such troubling thoughts. The fear of confronting them was too daunting. She didn't want to dwell on suspicions that might turn out to be baseless. Instead, she decided to call and assess the situation. Could it be that she was overreacting? Maybe it wasn't so unusual for a married couple to take separate vacations occasionally? But then the resounding slam of the front door caused Emily to startle. Did he just leave without even saying goodbye? That couldn't be happening, she pondered. She stepped out of the room only to be greeted by the harsh reality that it indeed could happen. Just as she was on the brink of tears, something on the table caught her eye. James had left his phone behind. It had a password she didn't know, but an incoming message briefly lit up the screen, providing her enough time to read it. "I'm already at the airport waiting for you, babe. Give me a call when you get there." Before she could process the message, the front door creaked open and James re-entered. He eyed Emily suspiciously, grabbed his phone, then planted a quick kiss on her cheek. "I've got to dash, love. Don't worry about a thing." Emily was momentarily frozen, then swiftly dressed and bolted out the door, frantically waving for a taxi. The ride to the airport was the longest, most excruciating journey she'd ever taken. She didn't know where to look for him, but unfortunately, they were immediately noticeable, their behavior reminiscent of smitten high school sweethearts. The woman was considerably younger than her. A gasp escaped Emily as she covered her mouth with her hand, watching them from a distance. So this was it. 5 years of married life, 5 years of believing we were a happy family, she mused. Emily and James's story had begun in college. James was late for an English class. He was the last one to enter and there was only one vacant seat. By a stroke of fate, that seat was right next to a very beautiful girl, Emily. Emily was a radiant beauty, so stunning that many guys felt too intimidated to approach her. This lack of attention paradoxically dented Emily's self-confidence. She started to believe something was amiss with her. So when James ended up sitting next to her, she was immediately intrigued by his apparent courage. But James, however, saw no other choice. He felt at ease sitting next to such an attractive girl, not because he was overly confident, but rather because he deemed himself invisible to her. He believed that he didn't stand a chance, so there was nothing to lose or be nervous about. When a class discussion paired them up, James found a reason to talk to her. That's when he discovered that Emily was not just beautiful, but also humble and friendly. Maybe that was when he realized he could sway Emily to his favor. As time went on, James grew more comfortable chatting with her, even forgetting their perceived social gap. One day, he offered her a ride home after class. By the end of the semester, they were officially dating. After graduation, they took the next step and got married. But now their marital bliss had crumbled. James was using their shared savings to whisk his mistress away to the Bahamas, while Emily would have to return to work the next day. She would come home to an empty house, waiting for her husband's return from his escapade. She felt utterly alone, without anyone to confide in, seek advice from, or even just vent to. Emily had grown up fatherless, a void that had always gnawed at her. She never experienced a father's guidance, love, or protection, a hollow feeling that left her feeling incomplete. People told her that as she grew older, she would overcome the absence and move on. But the opposite happened, the void magnified over time. In retrospect, she realized she tolerated so much of James's unacceptable behavior because she had no model of how a man should treat her. It pained her every time she mulled over this, and now it hurt even more as she found herself stranded in her sorrow with no one to turn to. Emily lost her mother at the tender age of 18. She had since been living with her aunt, but she always felt like an outsider. Her aunt insisted that Emily receive the same treatment as her own children, but Emily knew otherwise. She understood there was no substitute for her mother's love. She managed to stick it out with her aunt's family until she could escape to college. In the blossoming phase of their relationship, living with James was nothing short of paradise for her. The world seemed brighter, and their home was a cocoon of joy and love. However, as the leaves of time turned over, she began to unravel a less pleasing facet of James. She realized he was more aware of her vulnerabilities than she had ever been and was subtly manipulating them for his own advantage. James was employed part-time, which Emily was initially accepting of, while she dutifully clocked in her full-time hours, not begrudging him his seemingly easier schedule. However, she began to recognize an unspoken expectation falling heavily on her shoulders. The household chores were her domain alone. Every single day, she found herself knee-deep in dirty laundry, battling with stubborn stains and ironing out wrinkled clothes. Her hands constantly pruned from washing the never-ending pile of dishes, remnants of their meals serving as a constant reminder of her thankless job, and cooking that was an entirely different ballgame. Every night, like a ritual, she would be seen juggling pans and pots, stirring a delicious meal for James, who was ensconced in his own world. Despite all this, she remained silent, choosing to swallow her frustration rather than voice it. "Oh well, it's just one of those things," she would often mutter to herself. downplaying her growing resentment. James, on the other hand, was oblivious to her mounting exhaustion. He relished in the luxury of sleeping late, the sun high and bright before he would even stir from bed. His days were often spent locked away in his computer room, engrossed in his virtual world, leaving her alone to manage the real one. One evening, while she was busy stirring the pot, she called out, "James, could you please give me a hand with setting the table?" In a little love came the distant reply from the computer room, as always. She sighed, dropping the subject just as she had done countless times before, yet the silent plea for acknowledgement lingered in the air, marking the growing distance between them. When James's father, Robert, fell seriously ill, James implored Emily to move in with him, expressing a dutiful desire to look after his ailing father. Robert was aging, frail, and evidently incapable of managing himself alone. But as Emily had anticipated, she ended up shouldering the responsibilities of two men instead of one. However, Emily held no resentment toward Robert. Instead, she embraced him as though he were her own father, caring for him with patience and kindness. Robert, in turn, grew exceptionally fond of Emily. He noticed, perhaps more acutely than she realized, the imbalance in the way his son treated her. One day, he shared cryptic advice with her, saying, "You, my dear, were never meant to settle." His words puzzled her, leaving a question in her mind that would resurface later. When Robert's health improved, he suggested they return to their own home, grateful for his recovery but exhausted from the additional caregiving. A few months after they were settled, tragedy struck Emily's family. Her aunt succumbed to a heart attack. Although Emily felt a twinge of sadness that she wasn't treated with the same warmth her aunt showed her own daughters, her heart still ached at the loss. After all, it was this woman who sheltered and fed her after her own mother's untimely death. Deep down, she harbored a profound love for her aunt. 3 days into her mourning, James lost his temper at Emily. "She's dead, Emily. Stop bringing her up and, for God's sake, stop crying," he exploded. "James," Emily retorted, her voice wavering, "it's only been 3 days." She hadn't even cried that much. Her grief was mostly silent, carried in her heart rather than shown on her face. Yet James seemed to have little understanding or patience for her quiet sorrow. Now, in the bustling airport, Emily snapped back to reality from her reverie of thoughts. A part of her wanted to confront James, to vent her anger on his mistress. But it was too late. They had vanished into the crowd. While the airport bustled with people rushing to catch their flights, she stumbled out into the street, vision blurred with tears as she blindly bumped into passers-by. They deftly steered clear of her. In her emotional haze, she took a turn into a quiet alleyway and found a bench blanketed with snow. She sat down and let her tears flow freely. Emily lost track of time. She was roused from her sobs by the biting cold. In her emotional fog, a blizzard had crept up on her. She stood up, dusted the snow off, and rubbed her frost-coated eyes. Her eyelashes were fluffy with ice crystals, a sight that might have been beautiful if she could have seen it. As she started walking towards the exit of the alley, she noticed a man hunched over on the curb, his figure coated in snow. Her first thought was that he must be out of his mind to sit in this freezing weather. She was too wrapped up in her own turmoil to concern herself with him. As she walked past him, a glimpse of his eyes, empty and lost, tugged at her heartstrings. On impulse, she turned back and walked over to him. She rummaged in her pockets, found some cash, and extended it to him. He looked up at her with his melancholic eyes. He made no move to take the money, just went back to staring blankly into the distance. Caught off guard, Emily blurted, "Excuse me, sir, might you need some assistance?" Still receiving no response, she found herself questioning her actions. What on earth am I doing, offering help to a stranger who won't even acknowledge me? In a desperate attempt, she suggested, "Perhaps I could get you a warm tea or something?" The faintest hint of a smile tugged at the corners of the man's lips. Encouraged, she didn't wait for an affirmation. She stepped into a nearby cafe, purchased a hot tea and a sandwich, and brought them back to the man. Regardless of her own troubles, aiding the man brought a comforting feeling of accomplishment. It was as if she could momentarily set her worries aside. She handed the man the steaming cup of tea and the sandwich. He looked up at her, this time his eyes reflecting gratitude. As she walked away, the residual warmth in her heart made her feel slightly better. She was hailing a taxi when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find the man standing there. "I'm sorry, miss. I forgot to express my gratitude." "Thank you for your kindness," he said softly. She responded with a faint smile. "It's no trouble at all. We all face problems in life. I hope you find your way out of yours." "Thank you," he replied. Turning around, he slowly began to walk away. As he did, Emily noticed him shivering in the cold. A sudden urge surged within her to extend further help. "Wait," she called out after him. "How about you come to my place? You can warm up there and I can make you a hot meal." The man looked taken aback. "Are you sure?" "I'm just a homeless man." Emily shrugged. "Have you spotted any royalty here?" "I guess not. But it's unusual. Most people avoid me. People are different. That's all," she concluded. Emily waved down a taxi. Upon seeing her, the driver wore a friendly smile and held the door open. However, his expression shifted to unease when Emily extended her hand to help the homeless man into the vehicle. "I can't believe it. Are you actually bringing him along?" "He is not stepping foot in my car, lady." "I'm sorry," the driver declared. "Excuse me," Emily replied, taken aback. "I'm sorry, but look at him. He's clearly not clean, and he has a strong odor. I'm going to have to cancel your ride." "Who's going to cover the cleaning costs?" the driver retorted. Emily, angered by the driver's blatant disrespect, clenched her jaw, reached into her purse, and pulled out a wad of cash. "Would this sway your opinion?" she asked, handing him the money. The driver took the money, his fingers swiftly counting the bills. Once he recognized a generous amount, a grin spread across his face. "All right then, get in." The hefty amount Emily had handed the driver seemed to make him chatty. He nattered on about the weather and griped about the low fares he usually received. Once they reached their destination, the driver sped away swiftly. Upon entering the warm house, the homeless man let out a satisfied sigh. "It's so cozy here," the man said. "I'm going to heat up some food. You're welcome to warm up here or take a hot shower. The bathroom has towels and a robe you can use." "Thank you. I know I'm imposing, but I'll gladly accept your offer. Things have been pretty tough, particularly without a proper bath," he admitted. Emily questioned her sanity several times over. After all, she'd invited an absolute stranger into her home. She didn't even know his name, and now this man was in her bathroom. Regardless of how many times she questioned her decision, she couldn't find a logical explanation. It was a spur-of-the-moment choice. Her life would never be the same from this day forward. She was just putting the finishing touches on the table when the man emerged from the bathroom, fresh and clean. Emily gawked in surprise and finally remarked, "You look like a different person." He chuckled in response. Emily had managed to set the table in the meantime. As Dylan, the guest who had unexpectedly filled the chair usually occupied by James, tasted the warm meal, he complimented its flavors. His words weren't just a passing comment, but genuine praise about the deliciousness of the food. As she listened to him, an epiphany hit her. It had been an eternity since she had received any form of appreciation. Dylan, a man who was still essentially a stranger to her, displayed a keen sense of observation. He pointed out specific elements of the meal, appreciating the subtle blending of spices and the perfect balance of flavors. This simple act of recognition, so genuine and spontaneous, stirred something within Emily. It sent a ripple of excitement through her heart. It was then that she realized how accustomed she had become to her labor of love being overlooked. For so long, she had toiled tirelessly without a word of thanks or a morsel of gratitude. But with just a few sincere words, Dylan had managed to validate her efforts, and for that, she felt the warm glow of appreciation. Feeling a sense of comfort in Dylan's company, Emily found the courage to ask, "So, what's your story?" As the words left her lips, she saw a sudden shift in Dylan's demeanor. His easy smile faltered and his eyes welled up with unshed tears. It was clear that revisiting his past was a real pain with a star of ram. Just 2 short years ago, Dylan's life was the picture of normality, the kind most people yearned for. A loving wife, a sweet little daughter, and a cozy house in the suburbs painted a picture of perfect domesticity. They had plans for a joyous family trip to celebrate their daughter's 6th birthday. They'd all been looking forward to the little getaway. But life had other plans. As they drove on the rain-soaked mountain pass, their car lost control, skidded dangerously, and plunged over the guardrail. In that terrifying moment, Dylan's world was shattered. His wife and daughter, the core of his existence, were cruelly snatched away in the tragic accident. It was a harsh twist of fate that Dylan himself survived the crash, physically unharmed but emotionally devastated. As he shared his story, the pain in his voice echoed in the silence of the room. Emily could feel the heart-wrenching sorrow etched into every word. The anguish of losing his loved ones was more than Dylan could bear. He was engulfed by a sea of guilt, pinning the blame for their untimely deaths squarely on himself. Residing in the house once pulsing with life, the merry laughter of his little girl, the loving whispers of his wife, was now a torturous ordeal. The walls echoed with their memories, every corner a cruel reminder of his loss. To numb the piercing pain and escape his tormenting thoughts, he sought solace in the bitter embrace of alcohol. But the temporary escape soon spiraled into a damaging habit. As he retreated into a shell of self-condemnation, he pushed away everyone who attempted to extend a helping hand. Friends, family, their efforts to pull him out of his despair were met with a brick wall of refusal. For Dylan, life had lost its luster, its very essence fading into the gloom of his grief. His mounting addiction and the hollow echo of his family's laughter in his lonely house began to take a toll on his professional life. He received multiple warnings from his employers, each one falling on deaf ears. Inevitably, he was fired. A few months later, with his finances drained and debts mounting, he was evicted from the home that had once been the center of his universe. His life, once marked by love and laughter, had succumbed to an unending spiral of despair. Finding sustenance became a daily battle for Dylan. Initially, he resorted to foraging from trash dumpsters, an experience that left him grappling with feelings of degradation and despair. However, as he gradually learned the ropes of street survival, he discovered that there were some restaurants willing to lend a helping hand to the homeless. Establishments specializing in bread products, such as bagels and sandwiches, often had surplus food that they were willing to give away. His guilt over the tragic loss of his family had initially led him to this destitute lifestyle. However, over time, he began to see the damaging effects of homelessness. The harsh realities of street life began to weigh heavily on him, pulling him down into a cycle of despair that seemed increasingly difficult to escape. The lifestyle he had initially chosen as a form of self-punishment was now trapping him, threatening to consume him entirely. Emily listened to his tale with a heavy heart, her empathy palpable. She reassured him that he shouldn't bear the blame for the accident. She implored him to understand that a life consumed by guilt wasn't worth living. Her words were earnest, full of compassion and wisdom, as she painted a picture of the promising future that awaited him if he could only stop blaming himself and start putting his life back together. Throughout their conversation, Emily maintained steady eye contact, her eyes radiating warmth and understanding. Her kind smile never faltered, offering him comfort and acceptance. For Dylan, who hadn't felt such warmth and kindness in 2 long years, her generosity was overwhelming. This encounter with a complete stranger, who had not only let him in for a hot shower and a meal, but had also offered him empathy and advice, was a ray of hope in his otherwise bleak existence. The spark of hope that Dylan felt was unlike anything he'd experienced in the past 2 years. He'd spent so long aimlessly wandering, living on the streets, nursing his guilt and stewing in his sorrow, that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to have a purpose, a goal, a desire for a future that held more than just mere survival. Meeting Emily, receiving her compassion and understanding, and hearing her encouraging words had triggered something within him. He felt a strong pull, a stirring in his heart to break free from his self-imposed chains. He began to envision a future where he could stand tall, a future where the pains of the past did not dictate his path. The desire to change was no longer a mere thought, but a compelling force driving him. He longed for the warmth of a home, the comfort of a steady job, and the healing power of connections with others. Most of all, he yearned for self-redemption, a chance to forgive himself and the opportunity to rebuild his life from the ruins. At one point, Dylan realized he was still dressed in a borrowed robe. He jumped up, looking at himself awkwardly. "Is this yours?" he started, but Emily offered a sad smile. "It's okay. Don't worry about it." Dylan sat back down. Once they had finished their meal, he rose and began gathering his dirty clothes. Sensing his discomfort, Emily told him he could use her washing machine and stay the night. I'm sorry for being such a burden. I don't even know how to thank you. It's all right, Dylan. Don't worry. Everything's okay. Thank you once again. Dylan hesitated before asking his next question. Emily, may I use your computer, please? Of course. Feel free, she responded, gesturing towards her laptop. As Dylan began clicking away on her laptop, Emily sat in the living room, her mind swirling with her own tales of sorrow. She longed to unburden her heart to this stranger who had shared his deepest pain with her, but the words remained stuck in her throat. Gathering her courage, she rose and walked over to Dylan. Dylan, she started, her voice shaking slightly. I don't want you to think less of me for letting a stranger into my home. It's just my husband. Well, I hardly know how to put it. Today, he left for a vacation with his mistress. Dylan's fingers froze above the keyboard, and he turned to look at her, his eyes widening in surprise. Really? That happened? She nodded, sharing a brief overview of her predicament. Dylan shook his head in disbelief. I thought this kind of thing only happened in movies. I'm really sorry to hear that. So, what's your next move? She sighed heavily before responding. I'm going to file for divorce. But Dylan urged her to continue. I'm just not sure. He might not be on board with the idea. Dylan paused, his brows furrowing before he let out a soft chuckle. Wait, so let me get this straight. Your husband is off gallivanting with his mistress, and you're worried he might not like the idea of a divorce? The absurdity of the situation was evident, but it wasn't amusing. As Dylan looked into Emily's eyes, he saw a hint of fear mingling with the confusion. This kind, innocent woman, so beautiful in her simplicity, was caught in a whirlpool of emotional turmoil. Are you scared of him? He gently asked. I don't know. We've been together for 5 years, and now I just don't know what to do. Dylan nodded sympathetically. Go ahead and get some rest, Emily. We'll figure something out together. Dylan shook his head again and turned back to the computer screen. Exhausted, Emily decided to stretch out on the couch. She was awoken by the sound of her alarm clock the next morning. As she walked into the living room, she realized Dylan was gone. He'd left a note on the side table. Thank you, till we meet again. Suddenly, the house felt too quiet. Emily was hit by a wave of unexpected loneliness. It was as if she had lost something precious. She shuffled into the kitchen to make herself a coffee. The subsequent 2 weeks passed in a blur. Emily threw herself into her work, staying late into the night, just so she could return home exhausted and fall straight to sleep. 3 days after James departed, Emily mustered all her courage and started the divorce process. Methodically, she packed up all his belongings, including the robe Dylan had worn after his shower. Now, all she needed to do was deliver the divorce papers, return his possessions, and erase him from her life. She changed the house locks, too, just for good measure. This house was her sanctuary, a place that she had inherited from her parents. It was the one thing that was unquestionably hers, and yet she felt a creeping unease that she might have to battle to keep it.